The leaders of our nation's busiest ports are predicting rough waters up ahead, a slowdown in business.
The cargo cranes stood still. Massive port terminals along the U.S. coastline, from Los Angeles to Houston, from New York to Savannah, lay eerily quiet. Warehouses echoed with emptiness. Shipping containers that once moved in and out with clockwork precision were now stacked idly or not present at all. This wasn't the result of a strike or natural disaster. It was a man-made disruption, entirely political in origin. The ports were empty because the U.S. had become isolated on the global trade stage, a self-inflicted wound from a sudden, aggressive economic policy shift. The newly elected U.S. President Donald Trump had fulfilled his campaign promises by imposing sweeping tariffs on America's largest trade partners, and in doing so, had triggered a chain reaction that upended decades of global commerce. Before we start, hit the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. The announcement came swiftly after his inauguration. Trump, vocal for years about what he described as unfair trade deals, wasted no time in issuing executive orders that levied significant tariffs on imports from countries like China, Mexico, Canada, Germany, Japan, and South Korea. These were not token measures. These were sweeping across-the-board tariffs on steel, aluminum, automobiles, electronics, and agricultural goods. The intent was to bring jobs back to America, to force companies to manufacture domestically, and to narrow the trade deficit. But the international community saw the move not as a reform, but as an economic provocation. The retaliation came just as swiftly. America's trade partners, long-standing allies and competitors alike, responded with their own tariffs. China imposed new duties on soybeans, pork, and cars. The European Union targeted American whiskey, denim, and motorcycles. Canada and Mexico, two of America's closest neighbors and partners in the former NAFTA agreement, struck back against American produce, lumber, and dairy. The world had become a battleground of economic tit-for-tats, and in the crossfire stood the U.S. shipping and logistics industry. Ports that once bustled with workers guiding cranes, truckers lining up to haul freight, and ships queued offshore now felt the slowdown almost instantly. Exporters were hit hard. With tariffs now driving up the prices of American goods abroad, international buyers found U.S. products no longer competitive. Soybean exports to China, once $1 billion monthly trade, dried up. Car manufacturers, which had relied on both exporting vehicles and importing components, found themselves squeezed from both sides. The complex web of global supply chains unraveled with breathtaking speed. Importers faced no better fate. American companies that relied on raw materials and components from abroad were now grappling with skyrocketing costs. Many canceled orders. Others simply couldn't afford to stay in business. Retailers scaled back. Electronics manufacturers delayed production. Construction firms paused major projects due to surging costs of steel and aluminum. With both imports and exports collapsing under the weight of tariffs, cargo ships bypassed the U.S. altogether. Instead of docking in Oakland or Miami, they rerouted to Vancouver, Rotterdam, or Shanghai, where trade was still flowing freely. The image of an empty port is not just symbolic. It represented a total breakdown in the artery of globalization. These facilities, built to accommodate the enormous flow of global goods, became ghost towns of rusting infrastructure. The ripple effects were staggering. Thousands of longshoremen and dock workers were laid off. Trucking companies found their fleets idle. Rail yards saw reduced traffic. Warehousing and logistics firms, many of which had expanded rapidly to meet past trade demands, now faced a crisis of underutilization and insolvency. Beyond the economic toll, the tariffs shook the foundational assumptions of international trade. For decades, countries had built their economies on the premise of interdependence. The U.S., in particular, had shaped a world order where it served as both a primary producer and consumer. Its ports symbolized its role in global commerce, a hub of movement, exchange, and opportunity. But with Trump's tariffs, that role was forcefully relinquished. The world adjusted by turning inward or toward alternative partners. China, for example, began deepening trade ties with Africa and Southeast Asia, cementing deals that excluded the U.S. entirely. Europe expanded intra-EU commerce and accelerated negotiations with countries in South America and the Pacific Rim. Canada strengthened its economic relationship with the EU under CETA. Trade routes were redrawn and supply chains recalibrated, all under the assumption that the U.S. was no longer a reliable participant in free trade. The implications for domestic businesses were profound. Manufacturing firms that depended on imported machine parts saw costs explode. Even companies that produced domestically found themselves punished when retaliatory tariffs reduced their international competitiveness. A Wisconsin-based motorcycle manufacturer, once praised for its American craftsmanship, found its European sales evaporate overnight. Farmers in the Midwest, already operating under thin margins, now had stockpiles of unsellable crops. Silos overflowed with soybeans, corn, and wheat, destined for markets that had closed their doors. The effect on consumers was gradual but visible. Prices of everyday goods crept upward. Electronics, appliances, and even groceries bore the hidden tax of tariffs. Retailers, squeezed between higher wholesale costs and consumer pushback, cut staff and closed outlets. The very jobs that tariffs were meant to protect began to disappear. The logic that domestic production would surge and bring back a golden age of American manufacturing proved flawed in an economy that had long evolved past industrial isolationism. Global businesses that had once set up shop in the U.S., attracted by access to the American consumer market and the promise of stability, began relocating. Factories planned for Ohio broke ground in Vietnam instead. European firms scaled back their U.S. investments. Even domestic corporations began looking for ways to move operations offshore, circumventing tariffs by relocating entirely. The result was a paradox. Policies designed to strengthen American industry ultimately drove production and capital away. The damage wasn't just economic, it was reputational. America's role as a leader in global trade was suddenly cast into doubt. The notion of the U.S. as a dependable economic partner was replaced with wariness. Deals once negotiated in good faith became battlegrounds of suspicion. Diplomats found themselves justifying erratic policy shifts. Trust, so critical in the delicate dance of international commerce, had been eroded. At the ports, this loss of trust translated into a loss of purpose. Infrastructure that had cost billions to develop was underused. Expansion projects were frozen. Investment into port modernization halted. Municipalities that depended on trade revenue struggled to meet budgets. The economic shock radiated from port cities to the heartland, revealing the intricate interconnectedness that trade had built over generations. There was also a psychological dimension. The image of American power had always been tied to its economic dynamism. Ports teeming with goods, cities alive with industry, highways bustling with commerce. These weren't just indicators of wealth, they were symbols of influence. An empty port, silent and abandoned, was a jarring contrast to that image. It signaled not just a temporary slump, but a retreat from leadership. Critics pointed out that the global economy was not a zero-sum game. Success did not hinge on the failure of others. Yet the tariffs had been designed with a combative logic, assuming that economic advantage could be wrestled back by force. What the U.S. learned, painfully and publicly, was that trade was not so easily manipulated. Decades of interconnected investment, production, and consumption could not be unwound overnight without consequence. The national security argument, often cited in defense of tariffs on steel and aluminum, also faltered under scrutiny. It turned out that cutting off access to international supply chains made the country more vulnerable, not less. Essential industries found themselves lacking components or raw materials, reliant on dwindling domestic sources. The ability to project power, economic or military, diminished when the supply of critical goods could no longer be assured. For small businesses, the effects were existential. A boutique furniture maker in North Carolina that sourced Italian marble and Asian hardwoods suddenly found its costs triple. A craft brewer in Oregon faced tariffs on imported German hops and Canadian aluminum cans. Entrepreneurs who had once thrived in a world of global choice were now trapped in a cage of narrowed options. Many closed their doors, unable to adapt to the new regime. In agricultural heartlands, the crisis deepened. Cooperatives failed, equipment rusted, suicide rates among farmers rose. These were communities that had voted overwhelmingly for the president, believing in his promise to restore American strength. But the reality of economic warfare was not uplifting. It was isolating and brutal. Without access to foreign markets, the bounty of American agriculture became a burden, not a blessing. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, could you leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on U.S. ports going empty after Trump's tariffs? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.